It's a very, very complicated formula, one which we can't put into a computer model. So we don't know if we are causing global warming, but I say probably not. Now, if say it continues to get warmer, say the average global temperature goes up by 2 degrees, will this be mostly good or mostly bad? Well, I'll tell you what would be mostly bad is if the temperature went down by 2 degrees from its present level. World agriculture production would suffer greatly if this happened. Glaciers would begin to grow again. Now, you've heard the story about how it's terrible that the glaciers are melting, because if the glaciers melt away completely, there will be no more water coming to irrigate the fields. In the Himalayas, for example, this argument is put forward all the time, that these people depend on the meltwater from the glaciers to grow their food. So if the glaciers disappear, where will they get their water? Do you see the lack of logic in that argument? Because all you have to do is ask, what if the glaciers weren't melting? Then where would they get their water? What if the glaciers were actually advancing towards the villages and covering up the farmland with ice? How would you like that? It turns out, in fact, that the meltwater from the glaciers are not so critical for the agricultural irrigation. The most critical thing is that it rains and snows each year in the mountains, and then the snow melt comes down for irrigation. And that will continue to happen whether it gets warmer or not. But many of these arguments are not logical arguments, because if the glaciers stopped melting, as they say they wish, because first they say if the glaciers continue to melt, then they will be gone and there'll be no more water. This implies they must want the glaciers to stop melting. Of course, if the glaciers stop melting, then there will be no water either. So it's crazy, but the whole world has been sucked into this argument. And even people who call themselves scientists are putting this argument forward. Personally, I say let the glaciers melt. Then there'll be more farmland for the people who live in the valleys where the glaciers are. If we had all of Canada covered in glaciers, like it was 15,000 years ago, where would we grow food in Canada? Well, we wouldn't need to, because there'd be nowhere for people to live, because it would be covered in ice. So which is best, a world of ice or a world of tropical forests? Because during much of the Earth's history, most of the world was tropical and subtropical. There was no such thing as an Arctic climate in most of the history of life. It's been a warmer world. And if you study this, it's in my book, the references are there. The climate chapter has the most references of any chapter in the book. If you went to each of the references, if you studied thoroughly each of the references that I have in the chapter on climate, of which there are 136, you would know a lot about the subject. And there is a lot to know about it. But with my knowledge of it, and I've studied it thoroughly for pretty much 35 years now, since the issue became known, there is no cause for alarm, and we shouldn't scare our children into thinking that the world is going to burn up and die because of what we are doing. I don't believe it for a minute. It simply isn't true. And actually, a warmer world would be a better world for people and most other species. 90% of biodiversity is in the tropics and subtropics, where there is no hard frost. Ice and frost and snow are the enemies of life. It is a very specialized species which can adapt to frost below freezing temperature. We are not one of them. We are a tropical species, evolved at the equator. The only reason we can live even here in Rome is because of housing and fire and clothing. Otherwise, people here would die. They could only come out of Africa with fire, and then wearing the furs of animals and building wooden houses or made with sticks. So this is why we should not fear climate change and not allow elites to dictate to us how we should behave and drive us. They want to drive us back to living in little huts ourselves, like it was 10,000 years ago or something. As if you mentioned, the movement today, the green movement, is against fossil fuels. That's 85% of world energy. They are against hydroelectric. That's 7% of world energy. They are against nuclear. That's another 7% of world energy. They don't add up perfectly, but what you end up with is if you get rid of all those, you have less than 1% of the world's energy remaining. And of course, that would be not only the end of civilization, but the death of most of our population. We cannot live without energy, especially at the standard we have today, with long lifespans, good medical care, education, and all of the other things. So let's use our education to make sensible decisions about where we go in the future with these kinds of decisions.
Thank you, Patrick. I have one question more, but first, before I want to ask the audience if there is any other question coming from you. Do you want to use the mic?
I want to thank you for this very interesting discussion. I think that it's an honor for us to have you, because what we try to do at this university is to think critically about issues without preconceptions. So to have you speak about this stuff is very good for us and very interesting. So thank you very much. I am substantially in agreement with you, with your analysis. But I have a fundamental question. I just was listening to a conference on food security, in which the president of World Foods basically informed us that WWF now sets the standards for the kind of crops that can be raised. And by making very tough standards in terms of agriculture, they're cutting out all the poor peasants from the world from making products that then can be bought by the large multinational corporations. So in a way, I think that this environmentalist, food security, pure food, pure environment coalition, in a way, is really affecting the life of the growing number of people around the world. In my opinion, in a very negative way. But the question that I have is, in your opinion, is this kind of ecological deterministic extremism growing or receding? Do you see the world moving away from the ideology of Greenpeace and WWF? Or do you see that this is something that is expanding and more affecting the life of growing generations? What is the future? Are we going to become wiser about these issues, or are we going to become even more extreme?
That is a very good question, and I will start by saying I don't consider myself to be a futurist. As a matter of fact, I'm suspicious of people who say they are, because it's very difficult to predict the future about nearly anything. We know the sun will come up tomorrow, but from there on it gets much more complicated to try to predict what will happen. The force of the green movement as you say, is making it very difficult for people in the developing world. They boast, for example, they have stopped 200 hydroelectric projects. How do they want these people to read in the evening? It's important to recognize that electricity and literacy are very powerfully connected to each other, because you need light to read. And candlelight, as you may know from trying it, doesn't work very well. I've been to Indonesia a lot in the last 12 years, working for different people there, one of which is Asia Pulp and Paper. If you look at the environmental literature, you will see that this company is being vilified as evil and destroying the rainforest and all this stuff. They are actually employing 70,000 people growing trees. They're a paper company. They make their paper with trees, and in order to get the paper, they have to grow forests. But they are being made out like as if they are the destructors of the earth. And this country, Indonesia, is trying to develop itself. Indonesia still has nearly 70% of its original forest cover. And Europeans, where there is less than 1% of the original forest cover, are trying to dictate to them that they can't even develop a percentage of their land to grow food and fiber, to have a civilization. So it's hard for me to swallow this, and I end up in a lot of controversy over it. Then I am accused of being the villain with Asia Pulp and Paper, the evil forest company, you know, that sort of thing. So it's very powerful. What I can tell you is I always advise people to be prepared at any moment for a new intellectual dark ages to descend upon our civilization. We forget too quickly. We think we're already in the Enlightenment, that we've passed the dark ages of communism, for example. But Lysenko, the Minister of Agriculture under Stalin for 33 years, was only fired by Khrushchev in 1962. That's not very long ago. And during his time, he sent the best scientists, particularly the geneticists, to the Gulag to die. Thousands of them. That's a dark ages. Now, I'm not saying that Greenpeace is going to send people to Siberia to die, but they are killing the intellect of the human race with their thinking. It's a poison, and it's very powerful,